Valves and valve seats for all mud pumps are very similar. We'll show you how to maintain these parts on an oil well triplex pump so you can maintain valves and seats on nearly any pump. When preparing to inspect or change a valve and seat, shut the pump down and make sure it can't be accidentally started while you're working on it. Close off the discharge and suction lines and drain the pump. For access to a valve and seat, remove the valve pot cover. Be careful not to damage the threads by banging the cover on the pump. Pull the valve from the pot using a bent welding rod or a wire loop hooked through the hole in the valve stem. The complete valve includes the body, the valve insert or disc, and the insert retainer plate, often called the valve nut. Inspect the valve for damage. Look for wash cuts like this. You'll find a normal wear pattern like this, but that's okay, unless the grooves in the valve are really deep, like more than 1/4 of an inch. This valve and insert should be replaced. You can see they're worn so that they don't make a tight seal against the seat. Replace any valve that no good seal against the seat. If only the insert is worn or shows damage, and you're not replacing the valve seat, you can simply install a new insert on the old valve body. If you're using mission parts, the insert is reversible. You can just flip it over. You can only change the insert and reuse the valve if you're reusing the seat, so inspect the valve seat. Look for fluid cutting around the outside or on the inside bevel of the seat where the valve sits. These seats should be replaced. If you replace a seat, you shouldn't reinstall the old valve. If you replace a seat, replace the valve. If you do have to replace a valve, then replace the seat too. The reason is simple. A valve and seat together establish a wear pattern. If you break up a pair and put a different or new valve with an old seat or vice versa, there will be gaps where mud can leak and begin a wash cut that'll ruin the valve and seat. The rule is, don't split up a valve and seat. Don't mix one old valve with an old seat if the parts weren't originally together. And always replace valves and seats together. To replace a valve insert, place the valve in a valve vise if you have one. If not, an arrangement like this will suffice. Remove the nut using a hammer and short bar. Clean the valve body and threads. Clean the threads on the valve nut and spray the threads and insert with silicone lubricant. Tighten the nut on the valve until it hits the valve body. Make a mark on the stem and nut. Now reinstall the nut with insert in place and tighten the nut until its mark is 1/4 inch past the mark on the stem. Use a file or an emery cloth to smooth any nicks or burrs that you may have made on the valve stem with the vise. Pulling a valve seat from the valve pot requires a special tool called a valve seat puller. There are two types. One is a wedge type puller. Hammering on the wedge pulls the seat out of its bore. The hydraulic puller is probably more common. It uses a hand pump and hollow spindle hydraulic jack. Fill both with hydraulic fluid and bleed off any air. The puller head fits into the seat and hooks on its cross arms. Be sure you use the right puller head and make sure you hook it on the cross arms completely. A puller bolt is screwed into the puller head, and a piece of pipe called a stop fits over the stem. This will keep the puller from jumping out of the pot when the seat breaks loose. A spacer is screwed into the pot. Place the jack on top and connect it to the hand pump. If your puller isn't equipped with a spacer and stop, you need a safety chain to restrain the puller. Otherwise, a puller can bounce off the pot with enough force to kill a man. There's a fluid return valve on the hand pump which, when opened, will allow the jack to compress. Tighten the nut down on the compressed jack and start pumping. There's no substitute for a seat puller. This man is taking a chance on ruining the fluid chamber of an expensive mud pump. Never use a torch to cut a seat out of your pump. It's very hard to keep from cutting and ruining the fluid chamber. If you absolutely cannot pull the seat with a puller, you probably have the wrong puller head or have the jack installed wrong. If you have to pull a seat without a puller, have an experienced pump welder cut the cross arms, heat the seat, and then throw water on the seat only. It should shrink enough to pull loose. Don't try this without the supervision of someone who's done it before. As soon as you've pulled the seat, immediately wash the pump bore to remove mud before it has a chance to harden. This is especially important at the taper where the seat fits. Check the bore in the valve pot where the seat fits. Nicks and burrs should be repaired. Large fluid cuts and cracks aren't field repairable. Have your engineer or tool pusher look at these. A cut or crack in the pump bore allows mud to get in between the pump wall and the seat, where it'll start cutting into the seat and pump. You'll ruin seat after seat, and the fluid chamber too, if you don't have this type of damage in the seat bore repaired. Smooth any rough spots in the seat bore with emery cloth. Use a circular motion. Don't rub up and down. The circular motion helps keep the bore round and symmetrical. Now that's a good idea. Use a piece of welding rod or stiff wire to clean out the telltale holes in the pots. Clean the deck and bore with solvent and dry it thoroughly with dry compressed air. If there's any mud left in the manifold, use rags to dam up the ports and prevent mud from draining into your clean valve pot. It's important that the valve and seat be absolutely clean. Any dirt will interfere with the seal, allowing mud to get between the seat and pump. That's right, causing a wash cut. Pay attention to the parts you're installing. Make sure you have the right parts for your pump. Don't make substitutions and don't mix brands. Oil well seats have 3 cross arms, and mission seats have 4. Oil well inserts are not reversible. If you mix brands in the same pot, your clearances won't be correct. You'll end up having a mud leak, which will ruin the valve and seat, or the valve won't open far enough to get the pump up to pressure. Make sure the seat has a bushing in it to keep the valve stem in line. Clean the seat you're about to install with solvent, even if it's a new one. Dry it and install it immediately. Remember, you want a metal-to-metal seal. No grease, oil, dirt, or mud. Press the seat firmly into place. It should fit tightly. If it doesn't, check for dirt, nicks, burrs, or weld splatter on the seat or bore. If all else fails, check again to see that you have the right size seat. Once you have a good fit, place an old valve on the seat and drive the seat in with a large pipe and a sledgehammer. When the pipe bounces free with each blow, the seat is seated. Now, check the fit of the upper valve stem in the upper valve guide. If the guide bushing is egg-shaped, or if there's more than a 1/16 of an inch clearance all around the stem, replace the bushing. You're ready to install the valve now. Remember that seats and valves are in pairs. If you've installed a new seat, use a new valve. You should generally use a new spring if you're using a new valve and seat. Now clean the threads and gasket surfaces of the pot and pot cover. If the valve cover gasket is rough, cut, or out of shape, get a new one. Grease or oil the gasket surfaces and gasket and place the gasket in the pot. Apply some anti-seize compound to the threads and install the cover. Make sure the spring seats properly around the valve guide. Tighten the valve cover with 1,000 foot-pounds torque. That's one man on a 6-foot pipe. Don't hammer on the pipe or cover. These procedures should be followed for every valve pot on the pump. See if you can remember them. Of course, you should turn the pump off and close the valves on the suction and discharge lines from the pump. Drain the pump. Unscrew the valve cover. Remove the valve. Inspect it, and inspect the seat for damage or wear. If one needs to be replaced, replace both. Pull the seat using a seat puller. Don't use a torch to cut it out. Clean the valve pot thoroughly. Check it for damage. Repair any nicks or burrs in the seat area of the pot and on the seat and valve. Clean the valve and seat. Install the seat. Make sure no grease, oil, dirt, or mud gets between the seat and its bore in the pump. Drive the seat in with a sledgehammer and pipe, striking against the old valve. Check the clearance of the valve stem in the upper valve guide. It should be no more than 1/16 of an inch. Replace the valve guide bushing if the clearance is too great or if it's out of round. Now install the valve and spring. Oil and install the valve cover gasket. Use a new gasket if the old one was damaged. Install the cover. Use a 6-foot pipe to tighten it. Once you've brought the pump to operating pressure, check the telltale holes for oozing or breathing. If you hear breathing or see oozing of mud out the holes, this indicates the cover's not making a good seal. Check it for tightness and make sure the gasket is in place. During day-to-day operation, continually listen at the telltale holes for breathing, oozing, or the clank of a broken valve or seat. Follow these guidelines and you should have little, if any, trouble with the valves in your pump. You should be able to get 1,000 hours of service from a valve and seat. We're depending on you to do it right, so you and your entire drilling operation can depend on your pump.